The morning sun cast its golden rays over the neatly trimmed lawns of Maplewood Drive. The neighborhood was the picture of suburban tranquility, crisp, clean, and silent. Birds chirped in the trees, children played on sidewalks, and the smell of freshly cut grass filled the air. For the family, this neighborhood had always been a haven, a place where they could relax, feel safe, and live without the constant rush of the world outside. The protagonist, John, stood in his driveway, wiping his hands on a rag after finishing the small repairs on his car. His daughter, Emily, and their cat Mittens were in the front yard, enjoying the rare moment of peace. Emily was playing with her chalk on the sidewalk, drawing elaborate pictures of unicorns and rainbows, while Mittens sat lazily in the sun, flicking its tail at the occasional fly. It was a perfect scene, one that, as a father, John cherished deeply. But beneath the surface of suburban bliss, there was tension. The Homeowners Association, HOA, a governing body of a neighborhood, had always been a source of quiet frustration. They had an unyielding list of rules and regulations, and they were notorious for enforcing even the smallest infractions. Over the years, John had seen the HOA target neighbors for trivial matters: a mailbox that was an inch too high, a fence that needed repainting, or a lawn that wasn't just so. Most people simply tolerated it. They knew the rules, they followed them, and the HOA was content. But for John and his family, there had always been an underlying sense of unease when it came to the association. The problem wasn't just that the HOA had too much power, it was the people running it. Karen, the head of the HOA, was a woman known for her controlling nature. She took her role seriously, almost too seriously. Neighbors often spoke in hushed tones about her interactions with others, how she would fine them for the most minor infractions, always with a stern and unwavering approach. It was her way or no way, and the community had learned to avoid confrontation at all costs. John had never directly clashed with Karen, but he knew she had a watchful eye on his family. He had heard whispers about how she didn't approve of Emily's loud laughter, or how Mittens would occasionally wander into her pristine garden. John never thought much of it, until that fateful afternoon when the world they knew would come crashing down. The morning sun cast its golden rays over the neatly trimmed lawns of Maplewood Drive. The neighborhood was the picture of suburban tranquility, crisp, clean, and silent. Birds chirped in the trees, children played on sidewalks, and the smell of freshly cut grass filled the air. For the family, this neighborhood had always been a haven, a place where they could relax, feel safe, and live without the constant rush of the world outside. The protagonist, John, stood in his driveway, wiping his hands on a rag after finishing the small repairs on his car. His daughter, Emily, and their cat Mittens were in the front yard, enjoying the rare moment of peace. Emily was playing with her chalk on the sidewalk, drawing elaborate pictures of unicorns and rainbows, while Mittens sat lazily in the sun, flicking its tail at the occasional fly. It was a perfect scene, one that, as a father, John cherished deeply. But beneath the surface of suburban bliss, there was tension. The Homeowners Association, HOA, a governing body of a neighborhood, had always been a source of quiet frustration. They had an unyielding list of rules and regulations, and they were notorious for enforcing even the smallest infractions. Over the years, John had seen the HOA target neighbors for trivial matters: a mailbox that was an inch too high, a fence that needed repainting, or a lawn that wasn't just so. Most people simply tolerated it. They knew the rules, they followed them, and the HOA was content. But for John and his family, there had always been an underlying sense of unease when it came to the association. The problem wasn't just that the HOA had too much power, it was the people running it. Karen, the head of the HOA, was a woman known for her controlling nature. She took her role seriously, almost too seriously. Neighbors often spoke in hushed tones about her interactions with others, how she would fine them for the most minor infractions, always with a stern and unwavering approach. It was her way or no way, and the community had learned to avoid confrontation at all costs. John had never directly clashed with Karen, but he knew she had a watchful eye on his family. He had heard whispers about how she didn't approve of Emily's loud laughter, or how Mittens would occasionally wander into her pristine garden. John never thought much of it, until that fateful afternoon when the world they knew would come crashing down. John had always heard stories about Karen, the woman who headed the homeowners association, but he never gave it much thought. At first, she was just another face at the annual neighborhood meetings, always sitting in the back, never speaking up unless it was to make a remark about someone's yard or fence. She was a figurehead, someone you avoided eye contact with, someone who enforced rules with cold detachment. But as time went on, John began to realize that Karen's influence was far greater than he initially thought. She had a way of subtly weaving herself into the fabric of everyone's lives. Neighbors whispered about her fines, her complaints, and her ability to make small problems into personal vendettas. John had noticed her walking past his house more often, her eyes scanning his front yard like a hawk eyeing its prey. One afternoon, Emily and her friends were playing hopscotch in the front yard, their laughter filling the air. Mittens, ever the curious cat, wandered to the corner of the yard where Karen had planted a row of perfectly trimmed rose bushes. John had been watching from the kitchen window when Karen appeared on the sidewalk, her eyes narrowing as she saw Mittens wandering near her precious roses. It was then that John first saw the true nature of Karen's control. She marched up to him, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Your cat is trespassing on my property," Karen said, as if the simple act of Mittens walking near her bushes was the worst offense imaginable. John was taken aback, trying to defuse the situation with a polite tone. "He's just a cat, Karen. He's not doing any harm." But Karen was undeterred. She handed him a leaflet from the HOA outlining strict rules about animals on the property. Her eyes locked with his, and in that moment, John understood this was more than just a complaint, it was a power play. Karen wasn't interested in resolving issues, she was interested in asserting dominance. That evening, John sat down with Emily, explaining the situation. It was just a minor incident, but it planted a seed of discomfort. The HOA wasn't just about maintaining the neighborhood, it was about controlling the people who live there, and Karen was its enforcer. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low in the sky and the heat of the day begins to fade into a cool evening breeze. Emily and Mittens were outside again, enjoying the rare moments of peace that John had come to treasure. He was tinkering with his old bicycle in the garage when he heard it, the sound of tires screeching against the pavement, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone stomping up his driveway. John looked up, his heart skipping a beat. It was Karen. Before he could even step outside, Karen was already at his front door, banging on it. The harsh sound of her knocks echoed through the quiet neighborhood. He opened the door, trying to keep his composure. "You need to control that cat," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "It's been on my property again. I've had enough of this." John, tired of the constant harassment, tried to reason with her. "Karen, I've told you before, Mittens is a cat. He roams sometimes, but he's harmless." But Karen was having none of it. Her face was flushed with anger, her body tense as if ready to explode. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, John wondered if this would be another one of those exchanges that would end with both of them going their separate ways, each holding onto their grievances. But this time was different. Suddenly, without warning, Karen pulled out a small metallic object from her purse. The glint of metal caught John off guard as she raised it, her hand trembling. "Stay away from my roses," she hissed, her voice almost unrecognizable in its fury. The sight of her holding the object in such a threatening manner was enough to freeze John in place. In that split second, time seemed to slow, but before John could react, Karen lunged forward, and the world erupted in chaos. John stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at the scene before him. Emily, who had been playing nearby, was now lying motionless in the yard, her face pale and lifeless. Mittens, too, lay next to her, its once vibrant coat now stained with blood. The world seemed to spin as John rushed to his daughter's side, his hands trembling as he checked for signs of life. Her pulse was weak, barely detectable. He could hear her shallow breaths, but there was no time to waste. The terror of the situation gripped him like a vice. He turned to Karen, who was standing there, her expression one of cold indifference. She didn't seem remorseful. She didn't seem scared. She simply watched him, her eyes devoid of any emotion, as if she had just completed a task. John screamed for help, his voice hoarse with panic. The neighbors came rushing out, but it was too late. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but the damage had been done. Emily was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, her injuries severe. Mittens, though alive, was badly hurt, and John couldn't help but feel that part of his family was now shattered forever. As the paramedics worked, John's mind raced. How could this have happened? Why had Karen gone so far? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a fight over property anymore. This was something much darker. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and endless paperwork. Emily was still in critical condition, her body bruised and battered, but her spirit remained unbroken. The doctors were hopeful, but John couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The police investigation was launched immediately, but Karen had disappeared. She wasn't at home, and her car had been missing since the incident. The detectives questioned John, his neighbors, and anyone who might have seen anything, but no one had any answers. It was as if Karen had vanished into thin air. As the days turned into weeks, John grew more frustrated. The investigation seemed to be going nowhere. The authorities were doing their best, but Karen's disappearance only deepened the mystery. John couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The world he had once known, his peaceful neighborhood, his family had been shattered, and now the culprit was nowhere to be found. In the meantime, John had to keep up appearances. He had to be strong for Emily, who, though recovering physically, was traumatized by the events. Every day, he watched as she relived the nightmare, the images of Karen's cold, unfeeling face burned into her memory. The lack of answers, the uncertainty, and the ever-growing feeling of isolation made it harder for John to focus on anything but the anger that simmered beneath the surface. The justice he so desperately sought seemed just out of reach, and with Karen on the run, it was unclear whether he would ever find the closure he so desperately needed. The aftermath of the incident had shaken the entire neighborhood. The once tight-knit community of Maplewood Drive was now divided, its residents unsure of what to make of the tragedy that had unfolded. Some rallied behind John and his family, offering support and comfort in the wake of the attack. Others, however, grew quiet, afraid of what might happen next. Karen's absence only fueled the tension. Many of the neighbors speculated about her whereabouts, but no one had any answers. Some whispered that she had left the neighborhood for good, while others believed she was hiding, waiting for the dust to settle. But the silence was deafening, and it was clear that the sense of community that had once bound the neighbors together had been irrevocably damaged. For John, the hardest part was seeing the divided reactions from his neighbors. Some who had once been friendly, even welcoming, now avoided him, as if the tragedy had made them uncomfortable. There were those who kept their distance, uncertain of how to approach a man whose life had been so violently upended. And then there were the few who stood by him, offering their support in whatever way they could. The fractured community left John feeling isolated, as though the very fabric of the place he once called home had been torn apart. The walls of his house, once a symbol of security, now seemed like a prison. Every corner of the house, every empty space, reminded him of the violence that had intruded into his peaceful life. As he stood in his living room, staring at the empty space where Emily's laughter had once filled the air, he realized that the neighborhood he had once loved was no longer the same. The fight for justice had only just begun, and with it, the slow unraveling of everything he had known. The legal proceedings were long and grueling. Despite the fact that Karen was still missing, the authorities were determined to bring her to justice. The courts moved forward with a case against her, citing her actions that had led to the violent assault on John's daughter and their cat. John sat in the courtroom each day, his heart heavy with the weight of the proceedings. His legal team worked tirelessly, presenting evidence, calling witnesses, and fighting for justice. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who had gone too far, whose obsession with control had turned deadly. But Karen's defense team was equally determined, painting her as a woman who had been provoked by the actions of John's family. The battle was fierce, and the emotional toll was immense. Emily was called to testify, her voice trembling as she recounted the horrors of that day. She was strong, brave, and determined, but the trauma was still raw. Each word she spoke seemed to cut through John's heart like a knife. Karen's defense attorney argued that the attack was a result of years of stress and frustration, that Karen had been pushed to her breaking point by the constant noise and disruption caused by John's family. But John wasn't buying it. There was no excuse for what had happened, no justification for the violence that had been unleashed on his family. The courtroom battle raged on, but with each passing day, John felt a sense of exhaustion creeping in. The legal system was slow, and the fight for justice seemed endless, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. Emily Mittens and the memories of what had been taken from him drove him forward, even as the emotional weight threatened to crush him. After months of legal battles, court dates, and media attention, the case against Karen was finally resolved. The verdict was delivered, and while Karen had been found guilty of her actions, the sentence was far from the justice John had hoped for. She received a minimal punishment, something that didn't feel like enough given the pain she had caused. But despite the injustice, John knew that his family had to move on. The trauma, the heartbreak, and the scars would always remain, but they had survived. Emily, though still haunted by the memory of that day, was recovering. Mittens, though scarred, had found a new sense of comfort in the family's new life. John knew that they couldn't stay in Maplewood Drive any longer. The neighborhood had become a symbol of all that had gone wrong, a place where their peace had been shattered. So, they packed their belongings and moved to a new city, far away from the memories of Karen and the chaos she caused. As they settled into their new home, John realized that the future wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about healing, about finding a new beginning. The past would always be a part of them, but they were determined to leave it behind and build a life filled with hope and peace.